Hey BookTube. So in this video, I'm going to attempt something that is going to be quite difficult for me to do. And it's going to be reviewing a book that I read, but it's a history book, a big fat 1,000-page history book. I don't have a physical copy of it because I read it on my e-reader, but the book is The German Genius by Peter Watson. I just have the front page of my e-reader on here because the title doesn't actually show up on the cover of this e-edition, but the subtitle is Europe's Third Renaissance, the Second Scientific Revolution, and the 20th Century. And then, if I turn it off here, then that shows you the cover, which is just a bunch of quotes all the way along about different aspects of German culture. So this is what I'll be holding up as I talk. And the reason why this is going to be difficult is because nonfiction books, as much as I enjoy them, they're a lot more difficult for me to follow and to track the main point of compared to fiction books. Because with a fiction book, you can follow the main thread through the arc of the story, right? And maybe nonfiction books have their own version of that, but I'm not very adept at picking those out and being able to explain them openly as I would as, say, a novel. So I'm going to try it with this one. That's the whole reason why I'm doing this, is to give it a try. I do have pages of notes here to help me follow along. So the premise of this book is history of German culture. And from around mid-1800s, or no, mid-1700s, so the mid-18th century to the end of the 20th century, which is about, 250 years of history. And so it justifies its 1,000 pages, because that's a lot of history to cover. And the introduction of this book is quite long. It's around 50 pages, and the whole purpose, and in that 50-page introduction, he gives his reason for why he's writing a book like this. Because he thinks that German ideas, or the German influence on Western culture, has been severely undermined to the point, or even ignored, or even just vilified, because ever since the end of World War II, so he says the ghost of, say, Hitler or the Holocaust have both had negative effects on how people in the West view Germany's place in the development of Western thought, in all different aspects. So when I say German culture, I mean in aspects of education, literature, poetry, science. He also goes into history, and also in business and I want to say mechanics, but that doesn't strike me as the right word. Mechanics, I mean in the sense of like inventions. Also in the structure of the university, so education, and even politics to some extent, or political thinking, and or music, painting, those as well. And in that introduction, he talks about, he gives a lot of data and quotes to back up his argument that Germany has been unfairly neglected ever since Hitler and the Holocaust. But he says that those should not define the contribution or the enormous good that Germany has brought, or at least enormous change that Germany has brought in Western culture. And he compares it to the Italian Renaissance, which is why he calls it another Renaissance. And he takes that as his running thesis, and then he goes on to the book to argue for that thesis, which I'm going to say right off the bat, I found it quite convincing. There's a lot of names in here that you will not recognize, maybe some of them, but a whole lot of them that you wouldn't. And he gives a lot of great portraits of these characters and their contributions into thought, which you will recognize, certainly, especially if you're interested in the arts, but even examples of how to do history or how to structure a university or the concept of a PhD. These are all ideas that come from Germany. And so I'm gonna say also right off the bat, I found that this book was essentially could be called a history of the educated middle class, because when he's giving a history of German culture, it's the educated middle class that's really the focus here, because you get the disparity, and what I mean by that is like you have this disparity. You have like the middle class, you have the higher class, or in Germany for the long time it was like the aristocracy, but then in the middle class you have a whole mixed bag of different people. And the educated middle class are the ones who are like the artists, the scholars, the ones who are educated in the new standards of the day, and who are separated from, say, the more practical middle class, which would be like businessmen, lawyers, and doctors, that kind of thing. So he separates those two because he's not, except for when he's talking about advances in medicine, but he doesn't really talk about law or business or any of those like real world consequences like right aways. He's talking more of advances in ideas, advances in different ideas of thought, and advances in how to approach education and science, and different versions of art, even architecture he focuses on as well, and music. And so one of the main themes of this book is this idea of high culture and political indifference, which he connects to, and political indifference would be what he would connect to what he calls a German inwardness. So in Germany, for a long time, it was one of the most traditional political structures in Europe, all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th century. So you have like your traditional aristocracy, you have the Kaiser up top, or the king, and they were very strict in their rulings. The people didn't really have a whole lot of say, and then when some democratic elements were introduced into German society, it was more performative, more than it was any kind of real political change. So he says that Germany was very conservative in its politics for a very long time, and so the reaction, or at least the lack of reaction to that, is that this idea in Germany where it was the focus of the inward person in relating to the high culture. We call it high culture today, which is like, your music, your art, your literature. Back then they had their own term for it, which they didn't consider it like high culture versus low culture. They just had culture, which was just these ideas, or these influences. And it was in this inward way was a way to separate the arts from politics. So then, because their political structure they had virtually no say, it was very common and very accepted to pull back from your current politics and to focus more on your advances in whatever arts that you were interested in, and to be cultured in whatever that was. And it was so then whatever would happen in the political sphere, you kind of just took it as it went, and whatever changes it had to do with you you just kind of adapted and you moved along. It was the political indifference was seen as like this almost like a virtue of being different, or being almost apathetic to whatever was happening in the political sphere, because you couldn't change anything anyways. You were the ones shaping and forming culture. So And part of this culture, culture of the arts and of this evolving idea of education and scholarship, was this clash between rationality and irrationality, or irrationality or intuition, uh, and you can see that in the idea of the romantic influences at the time. So you see, I think most people, at least most people who watch this channel, maybe you don't know, but you have the ideas of the Western Enlightenment, bringing ideas of doubt and rationality to what had once been a religiously dominated Europe, and this was all across Europe. The key thinkers are usually pointed out in France, like ideas like Voltaire and Rousseau, and there's more, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. But you also have in Britain, you got Hume, but then you have these skeptics, or these bringing this enlightenment, and in Germany there was a clash of that was more poignant, and that would go on to influence a lot of subsequent German history, where you have this idea of, is rationality really what it really hold the potential that the enlightened thinkers say it does? And it's almost like a disillusionment to, or a reaction to this enlightenment, with coming through the Romantics. There's a lot of Romantic German thinkers where you have, like, for example, influences in the arts, like Goethe as well. I think I'm saying that right. Goethe, the author of Faust and the Sorrows of Young Werther. And I'm just going to pronounce all these German names as I understand them, because I'm not a German speaker, so I'm going to butcher them anyways. But yeah, you have this clash between this irrationality and this rationalism, and then when you have the key figures such as Kant, Immanuel Kant, I'm sure everyone who's watching this knows who that is, where he brought in this whole different perspective of, like, this intuition, this a priori reasoning, or not reasoning, but a priori way to come to understanding of the world, where he critiques rationality and how influential his ideas were in this respect, because it was like this bombshell that was in contrast to all these ideas, this praising of rationality that had gone before. So, like, you have this huge influential figure who would go on to shape a lot of the thought of Germans going forward as well. And what I found most interesting too about this book is that he actually, Peter Watson, he studies this period of history quite in depth, of what he calls of this age of doubt, this pre-Darwin age of doubt. So basically, like mid-18th century to before Darwin publishes his Origin of Species, where you have this age where even though religion is still pretty strong in Germany, and theology is developing in actually quite radical ways in Germany, because the ideas of the infallibility of the Bible is being questioned, and how much truth is in the Gospels, how much you have different alternative perspectives on the kind of figure Jesus was, and these are developing in theology at the time in Germany. But then you also have these figures of the speculative. I'm going to call them the speculative, or what he calls them the speculative philosophers, where you have the decline in the authority of religion, but you have this incredible religious fabric in society that you cannot do away with. And what he calls the speculative philosophers, the main thinkers being like Hegel, or even Karl Marx to an extent, where they're trying to fill this vacuum in religious faith with a very theological set of ideas that are grounded not so much in scientific facts, but in speculative theological facts, and yet they're profoundly secular attempts at trying to understand human's place, or the human place, or more specifically the German place, in not only history but in scientific progress. And you see that, of course, most with Hegel, and then later on with Marx, where they take these. And another thing about that theology aspect, it's amazing. One of the themes in here that Watson always points out is just how amazing it is that a lot of these geniuses that influenced German society, they came from families where their father was a pastor. Their father was a pastor, and even if they don't stay religious themselves, they still hold on to that religious framework that they grew up in, even if they revolt against it, and it still works its way into the fabric of whatever secular ideas that they end up advancing forward. But you also have the ideas of individuality, individualism, the inner self relating to the collective. So you have this constant tension between the concept of individuality, the inner self, versus the extreme of individuality, which is individualism, which the Germans saw in England, especially in the economic system. I'm going to say the French here, but it's going to be terrible. But laissez-faire, the economic system, free market capitalism, and then you also have the individualism of the rising America as well. And there was this reaction against these ideas as well, where they see individualism as a destroyer of culture, as a way of destroying things that they valued most, and yet at the same time they were a big proponent of being of this inward self, of this individual development, which was very was also influenced by, pietism, which is a religious movement which was akin to the Puritans in its strict self-discipline. And then you relate it to this increase of German nationality. So Germany as a country didn't become this unified state until 1870, and then after that, because but before that you have many of these ideas of this concept of Germanness, of being a German identity, even though you have all these small different locations in Central Europe that usually speak the same language, but they have their own leaders, their own distinct flavor of Germanness. But then, but there's a lot of obsession over Germanness as this distinct ideal that was separated from, or that transcended these individual locations of, or counties, or however, I forget what the term is, different sections of what would be later become Germany. This developed long before Germany became this unified state as a political entity, and that would go on to be extremely important, especially when you get to World War II and you get to Hitler, who takes us over. So you have you have this individual versus the collective. The idea, the German word is Volk, which is what we use, folks, hey folks. It's folk, folklore, folks of the people, basically. Then you have this collective identity, but then you also have this inward self-discipline of self-education. And the word for that is Bildung, so Bildung. If you're probably familiar with this term, if you know the German term Bildungsroman. I'm butchering that, but what that means is a novel. It's usually the form of literature where it's a novel of self-development or a novel of coming of age. So it's like usually it's like some innocent young, usually a male, going out into society or into the world and becoming acquainted, and through disillusionment, through a lot of disillusionment, but comes to grip with how the world really is, and either they become a part of that world or they rebel against it, but it's all part of their inner development and this inner education of society and of culture. So the conflict with, and then part of, so when you reach near the end, where do I want to go with this? I don't think I'm going to go there just yet. Let's go with the scholarship aspect, because the scholarship aspect is also one of the most interesting ways, because if you've been to university or you are familiar with how post-secondary education works, then you'll be interested to know that that was mostly a German invention, where they changed education into a way, like, and the concept of the PhD, where you could have non-geniuses, people who are still really smart, but they're not geniuses that will like change the whole fundamental understanding of whatever discipline that they're in. Non-geniuses who could contribute to the advancement of their discipline. Because the Germans were obsessed with the concept of genius, and for a long while they thought only genius was what moved progress in thought. So you have your Immanuel Kant, who comes along and blows everyone out of the water, and forever he's the people. You can't do philosophy in a certain way without referencing his ideas, because especially since he touched on so much in his ideas. Or you have you have all these, and you never know when they're going to come, because like genius is like this almost spiritual entity that is unpredictable. But then you have this concept of the PhD, where just anyone can come along. They can work really hard, study study the whole discipline as a whole, kind of get acquainted with it, but then pick out a little niche subject or a little sliver, the tiny little sliver, and zone in onto that part to an exhaustive degree, to the point where they are one of the fundamental experts in this area of study, and they have to be, and then they become experts in that. They generate knowledge through their expertise that advances their discipline, so they have to publish papers. So that's where professors have to publish papers constantly as part of their academic discipline, instead of purely being teachers, which is what they used to be before that, where they were just regurgitating what had come before. They were not expected to be advancers of knowledge of any way, in any sort. They were just taking what had come before, and then basically like school teachers, but just at a higher level. Now they are actually scholars or experts themselves, who are still teachers, but then they're also advancing knowledge. And then as Germany moves to World War One, you have this increasing disillusionment with modernity, which is usually or modernity, which incorporates like ideas of liberalism and capitalism, and which is usually seen as destroyers of culture. They're very industrialized, they're very mechanistic, and they destroy basically the muses, right? They destroy what is important in the person, the inner person, and they make, and then it's difficult to draw that out, because liberalism and democracy and like rule by the people, this was not totally these were seen as like ideas that were against the German essence, or the essence of Germanness. We are not people who are made for democracy, because for so long they've had this traditional political structure. Not to say that there wasn't people who were pushing against that structure, and people like Marx who was pushing against that structure. But for the most part, especially when World War I came, it was seen by the intellectuals, or the intellectual middle class, as this war of cultures, where Germans have a right to have a say or have a place in Europe, and they have to protect their culture as a sort of protection against the influences of the outside mechanistic world of, say, America or of Britain. Britain was the main one in World War One, but the political aspect did not really was not really a concern for the intellectuals. They did not take it seriously as much as they did where it was a culture war for them, even regardless of whatever the politics was. And that's another thing I should mention about this book too, is that he does not talk about politics unless he absolutely has to. So if you're not familiar of world history, or not world history, European history in the 18th century, 19th century, and the 20th century, you're going to be a bit lost in this book, because he doesn't really go into, say, the French Revolution and what its impact was, unless that impact directly touches on some German figures that he's going to talk about. For example, he doesn't talk a whole lot about World War I or World War II at all, except for the very obvious impact that it has on the intellectuals of the day and what they were writing about, what their concerns were, what this war meant to them. And then he doesn't mention the Treaty of Versailles at all. That doesn't get mentioned at all until it's maybe mentioned once or twice later, much later than when he actually talks about World War One. So you have to be mentally keeping track of the political history and how it starts, like how World War I starts. How does World War II start? How does he does talk about how Hitler comes to power, because that directly relates to Hitler's attitudes towards the arts. But other than that, he doesn't mention politics. Like, he doesn't mention the political aspects of Hitler coming to power. And so he deliberately avoids a lot of the contextualizing issues of politics. So I would recommend that if you want to read this, that you have some familiarity of those, of just general overview of world, or of European, I don't keep saying world, but it's European history up to this point, and so that you're aware of how this intellectual development maps onto the political development of the day. I'm sure I could have used a lot more of knowledge of that political history. I'm decently acquainted with it because I've taken some European history classes, especially in the 20th century. So that was I didn't get any sense that I was lost during this, but I'm almost certain that you would if you were not familiar with that upbringing or with that background of political history as well. We're reaching 30 minutes here. Theological development, World War I as a clash of cultures. I think I'll talk about the post World War I a little bit, and then maybe touch on Nazism a bit. But I think if you know World War I, at the very end of World War I, when Germany loses, they have democracy thrust upon them through what is called the Weimar Republic. And a lot of Germans were quite upset with this, and did not, at least German intellectuals did not think democracy was something that would fit them, that would benefit them. You have some intellectuals that do make a pointed change, like Thomas Mann, for example, is very noted to have been, when the World War I started, he was on the side of Germany, on the side of this being a political war, but then when the war is after, he changes his tune and thinks, liberal democracy is actually a great thing and an important thing. And the reason why, I'm not entirely sure why. I think it had to do with the influence of his brother, his older brother, who was a literary figure. But if you read, for example, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, you'll get that sense in there, very much so, of Mann's attitude towards Western liberalism, because he has a figure in there, Settembrini, who ends up becoming a spokesperson for the author, which Thomas Mann wrote himself. Like, he's saying, at points, this character is speaking for me, and Settembrini, he's very much a rational, politically involved figure, or not politically involved, but politically aware figure, who takes it as his main point to inspire political action in other people. So he's like the intellectual putting fuel into the movement, or into the impressionable people, and the impressionable young people who don't have all these ideas, because he's well read, he's always quoting some kind of literature. And he's very much a typical liberal viewpoint, though I do believe he goes to some extremes at some point in the novel. But yeah, so a lot of this, and so we have this Weimar Republic, and despite it being this, so the Weimar Republic lasts for about 14-ish years, give or take, and the Weimar Republic, despite the dislike that it has, or at least the bad taste that it left for a lot of intellectuals, because a lot of them were thinking, like, the Weimar Republic wasn't all perfect and roses. You have an economic crash in there. You do have some prosperity, but you have an economic crash in there, and then you have the rise of fascism before fascism is elected. So it's not this perfect period of history for Germany, but Peter Watson makes a point to dive into the intellectual development during that period of time, and says that it was quite remarkable, just on how much Germany accomplished in that period of time, after World War I to the election of Hitler. And so you have this conflict over values, like what are German people, like how are they as people, and then you have Hitler taking over that, adopting that. He goes from a German Volk to the Aryan race, and Hitler basically exploits that, and it doesn't convince all the intellectuals, because one of my favorite parts of this book was Peter Watson's analyses of Germans in exile. So once Hitler comes to power, you have a lot of intellectuals who were Jews, but then you also have a lot of intellectuals who objected to Hitler on an ideological basis, and they went to two main places, UK, and a lot went to the US. Most went to the US, and going to America, he follows how they influenced a lot of American culture too. So particularly in movies, in literature as well, but also in science. So a lot of scholars were moving, because when Hitler came to power, scholars were losing their position if they did not basically toe the party line, which not everyone was. So you have thousands of scholars who are without a job, and yet most of them are, really smart in their field. So then they're invited by Western universities to come and take over in a university, whether they add a position or they adopt or they form their own groups of like intellectual advancement, because there was a lot of funding for this as well from the different governments and also from wealthy individuals, and so I think I'm gonna end there. A rambling look at this book, where you have a whole bunch of Germans in exile, and how important that was to these different cultures, to American culture, to British culture, though not as much as to American culture, and how successful they were, a lot of them were, and how much they advanced different breakthroughs in science, and breakthroughs in different other fields of study as well. I'm struggling with specifics here because he does say a lot of names. There's just a ton of names that he brings up in this book, and there's no way for me to memorize that all and know who did what, other than say the big names. For example, Einstein. Einstein is an obvious one. He talks about Einstein quite a bit, and he also talks about the lesser known scientists, the German scientists who were part of Einstein's circle, who don't get as much credit, but who also were influential in their own ways. So I would say this was a really good read. It did take me quite a while to read it though, because it was a big work of history. I'm very glad to read this, and I hope to read some more of his books, because I believe he's got a 2-volume study of the Enlightenment, or at least an intellectual history, and then he also has a book that I have, a study of the intellectual development of the 20th century as a whole, not just German intellectual history, but all of modern, what's it called, the modern mind or something. But yeah, so that's my thoughts of this book, The German Genius by Peter Watson. This was an experiment. I wasn't sure if I was going to make this video. I know it's quite rambly, and it doesn't make quite as much sense as it could, but it's good practice for me to kind of get these ideas out there, or else I'm afraid I would forget a lot of the ideas that were driven home in this book. And it was really good to get myself thinking about this book a lot more, and to try to articulate it. So I appreciate your patience for that, and I'll see you next time.